He had millions in the bank, a foundation that had changed hundreds of lives, and a name that once filled every room he entered. Then a single night on a rain-soaked highway took his legs, his fiancée, and every reason he had left to fight. Daniel Whitfield became a man who wanted no one close enough to leave him again, but when a quiet, stubborn nurse walked through his door and refused to walk back out, something inside him cracked open, and what came next, neither of them saw coming. Let me introduce you to our new app, Allure TV. It's super simple to get started. You log in with Google or your email. In a few seconds you're in. This here is the home screen. Look how amazing it is. We feature dozens of intense, uncensored romance stories, organized by genre. We have mafia, billionaire, forbidden love, and contract romance themes. We have absolutely everything you could ever want. And the best part, no ads and no interruptions. Now look at this. Click here on the audio and start listening right away. You can even choose your preferred language. There's Portuguese, English, German, French. If you prefer to read, just click here on the ebook and that's it. The whole story appears for you to read at your own pace. And you can even interact. You are welcome to rate the story with stars and leave a comment. You can also add your favorite stories to a playlist and access them whenever you like. Do you like what you see? Go ahead and log in now. It is simple and free. You can find the link in the first pinned comment. The notification on Daniel Whitfield's phone read 7:14 a.m., and the pale light of a Manhattan morning pressed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse bedroom like an uninvited guest. He didn't reach for the phone. He hadn't reached for much of anything in 6 months, not since the night a delivery truck crossed the center line on the Taconic Parkway and folded his Aston Martin like a piece of paper, with him still inside it. The doctors at Mount Sinai had used words like miracle and lucky when they told him he'd survived. Daniel found that almost funny. Lucky men walked out of hospitals. Lucky men didn't stare at their own legs as though they belonged to a stranger. Lucky men didn't feel the phantom echo of toes curling against bedsheets, only to look down and see nothing moving at all. T10 complete spinal cord injury. That was the clinical phrase. 5 words that collapsed 34 years of momentum into a wheelchair, and a future he couldn't recognize. His bedroom smelled of eucalyptus. The diffuser, Eleanor would later learn, he kept running all night, because the scent was the only thing that slowed his breathing when the walls started closing in around 3 in the morning. But that detail belonged to a later chapter. For now, the penthouse was just expensive silence. Italian marble floors that his bare feet would never feel cold against again. A Peloton bike gathering dust in the corner, like a monument to someone who no longer existed, and a closet full of tailored suits he couldn't put on without help. His phone buzzed again. A calendar reminder. Physiotherapy. Langford Rehabilitation Center, 9 a.m. He swiped it away without opening it. The wheelchair sat beside the bed. Matte black, custom-built, worth more than most people's cars. Daniel transferred himself into it with practiced mechanical movements, arms bracing, core tightening, the swing of dead weight that still made something twist in his stomach every single time. He caught his reflection in the window glass as he rolled toward the bathroom. Dark circles, a jaw that hadn't seen a proper shave in days, and eyes that looked like they'd forgotten what they were supposed to be looking at. "You look like hell," he muttered to himself. His voice was rough, underused. There were days he didn't speak at all. By the time his driver, Raymond, pulled the matte black SUV up to Langford Rehab, Daniel had already decided this would be one of his shorter sessions. Maybe 20 minutes. Enough to keep Dr. Aiden from calling again. The rehab center was all glass and reclaimed wood, the kind of place designed to feel hopeful. Warm lighting, motivational quotes on the walls in minimalist fonts, the faint sound of lo-fi music drifting from somewhere. Daniel hated every square foot of it. Marcus Reed, his physical therapist, was already waiting by the parallel bars, broad shoulders, calm eyes, the kind of patience that Daniel sometimes mistook for pity. Marcus wore a fitted charcoal polo and had his sleeves pushed up to the elbows, a habit Daniel had noticed but never commented on. "You actually showed up," Marcus said, a small grin pulling at the corner of his mouth. "I was starting to think you'd ghosted me." "Don't flatter yourself." Daniel wheeled to the edge of the mat and locked his brakes with a sharp click. I'm here because Dr. Aiden threatened to send someone to my apartment. I don't need a house call. Fair enough. Marcus crouched beside him, positioning a resistance band around Daniel's right knee. Let's start with, I know the routine. Then you also know you've missed 4 sessions in 2 weeks. Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked past Marcus, past the windows, past the city skyline that used to feel like it belonged to him. I had things to deal with. Marcus didn't push. He guided the stretch slowly, his hands steady and professional. The band pulled. Daniel's quad trembled, not from strength but from the ghost of a connection between nerve and muscle that was still learning how to speak again after being silenced. Hold that, Marcus said quietly. Daniel held it. 15 seconds. 20. His breath shortened, not from pain exactly, but from the frustration that lived underneath everything now, like a second heartbeat. 25 seconds. Good. Release. That's it? Daniel's voice carried an edge. 25 seconds of shaking and I'm supposed to feel like I'm making progress. Marcus sat back, resting his forearms on his knees. He studied Daniel the way he always did, not with pity, not with clinical detachment, but with something uncomfortably close to understanding. Last month you couldn't hold that for 10, so yes, Daniel, that's progress. Progress toward what? The question came out sharper than intended. Daniel gripped the armrests of his chair, knuckles whitening. Walking, running, because we both know I never said running. You never say anything concrete. It's always small steps and one day at a time and you never let me finish a sentence. Silence. The lo-fi music played on, oblivious. A woman on the far side of the room practiced walking between parallel bars of her own, her daughter holding her elbow, both of them laughing at something Daniel couldn't hear. He looked away from them quickly, as though their hope was contagious and he didn't want to catch it. Your muscle response is improving, Marcus said after a moment, his tone softer now, deliberate. The nerves below T10 are showing signs of incomplete signaling. That's not nothing. It's not walking either. No, not yet. Not yet. Daniel turned the phrase over in his mind, like a stone he didn't know whether to keep or throw. It implied a future. It implied belief. And belief, he had learned, was just the setup for a longer fall. Marcus began packing up the bands. I'm scheduling you for Monday, Wednesday, Friday next week. Non-negotiable. You can schedule whatever you want. Doesn't mean I'll be here. Marcus paused, holding Daniel's gaze with a steadiness that bordered on stubborn. You know what I see when I look at you? A man who built a foundation that changed lives. A man who didn't quit on other people. But somewhere between that accident and this room, you decided to quit on yourself. He let the words land, then added quieter, I'm not going to let you do that without a fight. Daniel opened his mouth, to argue, to deflect, to fire back something sharp enough to end the conversation. But nothing came. The words stuck somewhere behind his ribs, tangled in the mess of anger and grief and exhaustion that had become his permanent internal weather. Raymond was waiting outside, leaning against the SUV, scrolling through his phone. He straightened when he saw Daniel come through the automatic doors, wheelchair catching the late morning light. Back to the apartment, Mr. Whitfield? Where else? Daniel said, and the flatness in his voice made Raymond look at him a beat too long before opening the door. The drive back was 15 minutes of Manhattan traffic, honking construction, a city that moved relentlessly forward while Daniel sat still. He stared out the tinted window at people crossing the street, their legs carrying them to places they probably didn't even appreciate going. A woman in a crimson coat jogged to catch a cab. A teenager on a skateboard weaved between pedestrians. A man carried a child on his shoulders, the little girl's laughter faint through the glass. Daniel pressed his forehead against the cool window and closed his eyes. When he got home, the penthouse was exactly as he'd left it, silent, immaculate, suffocating. He wheeled past the kitchen island where a protein shake Raymond had prepared, sat untouched, past the living room where the flat screen was dark and would stay dark, past the hallway lined with framed photographs he had turned face down weeks ago because he couldn't bear to see himself standing. He stopped at the window, 42 floors above the city. The skyline stretched out endlessly, glittering, indifferent. His phone buzzed one more time. A voicemail from Dr. Aiden's office, something about a new care plan. A home nurse recommendation. He pressed delete before the message finished, but somewhere in the system, a file had already been assigned, a name had already been matched to his case. And in a modest apartment across the river, a woman with steady hands and a quiet kind of courage was reading his chart for the first time, underlining the parts that told her this patient didn't want to be saved. She circled his name anyway. In the first 2 weeks after the accident, Daniel's hospital room at Mount Sinai looked like a florist's showroom. Roses, lilies, sunflowers, stuffed into glass vases on every available surface. The air was thick with competing perfumes, lavender from one arrangement, something citrusy from another, and cards piled up on the windowsill with messages written in hurried, heartfelt pen. Thinking of you. Stay strong. You're a fighter. People he hadn't spoken to in years suddenly remembered his name. Business partners, old college friends, distant cousins, board members from the Whitfield Foundation. They rotated through his room like a carousel, each one wearing the same careful expression of concern, each one staying just long enough to feel good about having come. Claire was there every day. She arrived each morning with coffee from the place on Lexington he liked, the one that did the oat milk flat white with a dusting of cinnamon on top. She'd pull the chair close to his bed, tuck her legs underneath her, and read to him from whatever novel she was halfway through, her voice low and warm, filling the sterile room with something that almost resembled normalcy. She wore her engagement ring like an anchor, twisting it absent-mindedly while she talked, and Daniel would watch the diamond catch the fluorescent light and think, "This is real. She's still here. This part didn't break." But hospitals have a way of revealing what people are made of, slowly, the way water reveals the true shape of a stone. By week 3, the flower deliveries slowed. By week 5, they stopped entirely. The cards on the windowsill yellowed at the edges and nobody replaced them. His college roommate, the one who'd sworn at the bedside that he'd come back every week, sent a text instead. "Crazy busy, brother, but thinking about you." And then silence. The board members sent emails now, formal ones, about the foundation's quarterly numbers, and whether Daniel had considered appointing an interim director. The word interim sat in his inbox like a small, polite knife. His phone, which had once buzzed so constantly that the nurses asked him to put it on silent, now went hours without a single notification. Daniel started checking it compulsively, not because he expected anything, but because the absence of sound was louder than any ringtone. "People have their own lives," Claire said one evening, her tone careful, diplomatic. She was sitting in the same chair, but it had migrated a few inches further from the bed over the past week, a distance so small it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't measuring everything through the lens of loss. She wore a fitted burgundy sweater, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and she looked tired in a way that makeup couldn't quite cover. "It doesn't mean they don't care. It means exactly that," Daniel said. He was sitting up in bed, a half-eaten tray of hospital food pushed to the side. The mashed potatoes had gone cold hours ago. "Caring is showing up. Everything else is just words." Claire looked at him. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not quite frustration, but the beginning of it. The first crack in a patience that had been holding itself together with both hands. "I'm here, Daniel. I show up every single day." "I know. Then why does it feel like that's not enough for you?" He didn't answer, not because he didn't have one, but because the honest answer, "Because I'm waiting for you to leave too," was something he couldn't say out loud without making it real. The weeks that followed carved a pattern Daniel learned to predict with almost scientific accuracy. The visits from friends dropped from weekly to bi-weekly to monthly to nothing. His sister, who lived in Chicago, called every Sunday for a while, then every other Sunday, then sent voice notes that got progressively shorter and further apart, like a radio signal fading as someone drove away. Even his attorney started handling things through email rather than coming to the apartment for their usual Thursday meetings. Each disappearance was quiet. No dramatic goodbye, no slammed door, just silence where sound used to be, and an empty chair where a person once sat. Claire lasted longer than the rest. He would give her that. She lasted through the transfer from the hospital to the penthouse, lasted through the installation of the wheelchair ramps and the grab bars in the bathroom, lasted through the night Daniel threw a glass against the kitchen wall because he couldn't open a jar of pasta sauce and refused to ask for help. She stood there in the doorway, barefoot, wearing a silk rose-colored robe, watching him breathe through the rage like a man drowning in 2 inches of water. And she didn't leave. Not that night, but Daniel could feel it happening. The slow erosion, the way she started pausing before she touched him, the way her goodnight kisses migrated from his lips to his forehead, to his shoulder, to nothing at all. He began testing her without realizing it, then with full awareness, snapping at small things, refusing to talk about the future, shutting down conversations about the wedding they'd been planning before the accident. He watched her face for the flinch, for the moment she'd finally break, the way a man presses a bruise just to confirm it still hurts. It came on a Tuesday. Unremarkable weather. She was standing by the kitchen island, her overnight bag on the counter, a bag that used to live in his closet, but now traveled back and forth with her like a suitcase that couldn't commit. "I can't keep doing this," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. She gripped the strap of the bag, her knuckles going pale against the tan leather. "I have tried, Daniel. I have tried to be enough for both of us. And Her voice cracked just slightly, a fracture line across porcelain. "You won't let me in. You won't let anyone in. And I can't love someone through a locked door forever." Daniel sat in his wheelchair by the window, the city sprawling behind him like an audience watching a private catastrophe. He wanted to say something. "Don't go, I'm sorry, I don't know how to stop doing this." But the words were buried under so many layers of pride and fear and fury that by the time they reached his throat, they had turned into something else entirely. "Then don't," he said. 2 words, flat as concrete. Claire stared at him. Her eyes glistened, and he watched her press her lips together the way she always did when she was trying not to cry in front of someone. A gesture so familiar it felt like a hand around his chest, squeezing. She picked up the bag. She pulled the ring off her finger slowly, as though giving him one final moment to say something that would change the ending. She placed it on the marble countertop with a soft click, the smallest sound he had ever heard, and somehow the loudest. She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the brushed nickel handle. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Daniel," she said without turning around. "I just wish you'd looked for it with me." The door closed behind her, the lock engaged with a mechanical thud. And then, nothing. The flat white from Lexington stopped appearing on his nightstand in the mornings. The chair beside his bed, the one she'd pulled close in those early hospital days, sat empty, pushed against the wall at an angle that no one corrected. Daniel sat in the silence of his 42-floor penthouse and listened to the city below, sirens, traffic, a world moving relentlessly on, and understood something with a clarity that felt almost surgical. Everyone leaves. The ones who say they won't are simply the ones who haven't left yet. He picked up the ring from the counter, held it between his thumb and forefinger, the diamond refracting the late afternoon light into tiny scattered fragments across the ceiling. Then he opened the drawer of the console table by the door, the drawer where he kept takeout menus and spare keys and things that no longer mattered, and dropped it inside. He didn't look at it again. But late that night, long past midnight, when the eucalyptus diffuser had run dry and the penthouse felt less like a home and more like a display case for a life no one was living, Daniel found himself staring at his phone. Not at any message. At the contacts list, scrolling slowly through names, dozens of them, hundreds, and realizing, with a stillness that settled into his bones like winter, that there wasn't a single one he could call. Not one. And somewhere across the East River, in a modest apartment with thin walls and a kitchen that smelled like chamomile and old books, Eleanor Voss was pinning her nursing ID to a fresh set of plum-colored scrubs, reviewing the file of her newest patient assignment, the one every other nurse at the agency had already refused. She read the warning notes in the margin: hostile, uncooperative, verbally aggressive. Do not engage in emotional conversation. She read them twice. Then she packed her bag anyway. Eleanor Voss arrived at 8:47 a.m. on a Thursday, 13 minutes early, because she believed punctuality said more about a person than any resume ever could. She stood in the lobby of Daniel's building, all polished concrete and recessed lighting, the kind of architecture that whispered money without raising its voice, and adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag against her shoulder. The doorman, a tall man in a grey vest with a name tag that read Gerald, looked her up and down with the careful neutrality of someone trained to assess visitors without appearing to judge them. "Eleanor Voss. I'm the new home nurse for Mr. Whitfield, apartment 42B. Gerald checked his tablet, scrolled, then gave her a look she couldn't quite categorize, something between sympathy and warning. "Elevator's on the right. He's expecting you." A pause. "Probably." The elevator smelled faintly of sandalwood and played a piano piece she almost recognized. She watched the floor numbers climb, 18, 24, 31, 38, and used the time to steady herself. She had read the file 3 times by now. She knew the injury, the prognosis, the medication schedule. She also knew the notes that weren't medical, the revolving door of caregivers, the complaints logged by each one, the phrases that repeated like a chorus: verbally abusive, refused medication, demanded I leave, threw a water glass near the wall. 7 nurses in 4 months. The agency had practically begged her to take the case, offering a rate 50% above standard, which told her everything she needed to know about what she was walking into. The elevator opened directly into a private foyer, marble floors, a single abstract painting on the wall, slashes of crimson and gold on white, and a heavy oak door that was already ajar, as if someone had opened it and then decided they didn't care enough to stand behind it. She knocked anyway. 2 firm, unhurried knocks. Nothing. She pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The penthouse was stunning and neglected in equal measure. The kind of space that belonged in a design magazine but hadn't been truly lived in for months. Spotless surfaces, untouched throw pillows, a kitchen island bare except for a prescription bottle and a half-empty glass of water. The curtains on the far wall were drawn, muting the morning light into something grey and provisional. Daniel was by the window, his wheelchair angled slightly away from the door, as though he'd positioned himself to look occupied without having to acknowledge whoever walked in. He wore a black crewneck and dark joggers, his hair pushed back but uncombed, his jaw carrying 2 or 3 days of stubble. He didn't turn around. "Mr. Whitfield, I'm Eleanor Voss. The agency sent—" "I know who sent you." His voice was low, unhurried, stripped of warmth. "They send someone new every few weeks. It's getting predictable." She set her bag on the console table near the entrance beside a small drawer that she noticed was slightly open, something glinting inside. "Then you know why I'm here. You're here because they're running out of people willing to babysit a grown man who doesn't want a babysitter." He still hadn't turned around. "How much did they offer you? Time and a half? Double?" Eleanor clasped her hands in front of her, standing in the open space between the kitchen and the living room like someone who had decided exactly where they intended to be. "Does the number matter? It tells me how desperate they are, and by extension, how difficult they think I am. I don't form opinions based on paperwork." That made him turn. Not all the way, just enough that she caught the profile of his face, sharp cheekbones, dark circles, eyes that scanned her the way a man reads the fine print on something he's already decided to reject. His gaze moved from her face to her plum-colored scrubs to the practical white sneakers she wore, and she felt the assessment land like a door being measured for a lock. "You'll last a week," he said. "Maybe 2, if you're stubborn." "I am stubborn." She said it without smiling, without defiance, just a fact offered plainly, like telling someone it was Thursday. Something flickered across his expression, surprise maybe, or irritation dressed as curiosity. He turned back to the window. "Your predecessor lasted 9 days, the one before her 4. There's a pattern, Miss Voss, and you're not going to break it." "Eleanor," she corrected, "and I'm not here to break patterns. I'm here to check your blood pressure, review your meds and make sure you're eating something other than whatever that is." She nodded toward the kitchen counter, where a protein bar sat half-opened and abandoned, its wrapper curling at the edges like a dried leaf. "I eat fine. Your chart says you've lost 14 pounds since discharge." Charts lie. Scales don't. The silence that followed had weight, not the empty kind, but the kind that sits between two people deciding what the next sentence will cost them. Eleanor held it without flinching. She had learned early in her career that silence was a patient's first test. If you rushed to fill it, they owned you. If you sat inside it without apology, they understood you weren't going anywhere. Daniel's fingers drummed once against the armrest of his wheelchair. A single, restless tap. Fine. Do your checks, then leave. Happily. She opened her bag and pulled out a blood pressure cuff, a small digital thermometer, and a notebook with a cracked leather cover that had seen better years. She walked to where he sat, and as she crouched beside his wheelchair, she caught the scent of eucalyptus, sharp, medicinal, layered over something warmer underneath, like cedarwood or skin that had been under blankets too long. It was the smell of a man who had been alone in a beautiful room for a very long time. She wrapped the cuff around his left arm. Her fingers grazed the inside of his wrist as she adjusted the Velcro, and she felt him stiffen, a tiny involuntary contraction, as though human touch had become something his body no longer knew how to process without alarm. "Relax your arm," she said softly. "It is relaxed." "It's not." She looked up at him. Their faces were close, closer than either had anticipated. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in the dim light, and up close she could see the exhaustion etched into them like handwriting, the kind that sleep alone couldn't erase. "I'm not going to hurt you, Mr. Whitfield." "Daniel," he said, and immediately looked annoyed with himself for offering it. "Daniel." She held his gaze for one beat longer than necessary, then returned to the cuff. The machine hummed. Numbers climbed. She noted them in her book without comment, though the reading confirmed what she'd suspected. Elevated, consistent with chronic stress and poor sleep. She finished the rest of the assessment in professional silence. Temperature, pulse ox, a visual check of the pressure points on his lower body for skin integrity. He endured it the way a man endures a toll booth, with visible impatience and the understanding that resistance would only make it take longer. When she was done, she packed her things neatly, stood and slung the bag over her shoulder. "Same time tomorrow," she said. "I didn't agree to tomorrow. You didn't agree to today either, and yet here we both are." She walked toward the door, her sneakers quiet on the marble. At the threshold she paused, not dramatically, not for effect, but the way someone pauses when they want to say one more thing and have already decided they will. 7 nurses in 4 months, she said, her back still half turned. "That's a lot of energy spent pushing people away, Daniel. Must be exhausting." She didn't wait for an answer. The door clicked shut behind her, soft and definite, and Daniel sat in the silence she left behind, staring at the space where she'd stood, his left wrist still warm where her fingers had been. He told himself it meant nothing. But when 8:47 arrived the next morning, he found himself glancing at the door and hating himself for it. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and the one after that. By the end of the first week, Daniel had tried every weapon in his arsenal. He ignored her entirely on Monday, sitting at his desk with noise-cancelling headphones on, pretending to read financial reports on his laptop while she checked his vitals in silence. On Tuesday, he told her the agency had called and she'd been reassigned, a lie so transparent that Eleanor simply raised an eyebrow, pulled out her blood pressure cuff and said, "Left arm, please." Wednesday, he refused to open the door. She sat in the hallway for 40 minutes, her back against the wall beside his doorframe, answering emails on her phone, until Gerald from the lobby called up to say she was making the other residents uncomfortable. Daniel opened the door just to tell her she was ridiculous, and she walked past him into the apartment before he could finish the sentence. "That doesn't count as an invitation," he said, wheeling after her. "It counts enough." She set her bag on the kitchen counter and began unpacking. "Your pulse ox was low yesterday. I want to recheck it." "My pulse ox is fine." "Then this will take 30 seconds and you can go back to pretending I don't exist." Thursday was the worst. He woke up in a bad place. The kind of morning where the phantom sensations in his legs were particularly cruel, a tingling that felt like the beginning of movement but led absolutely nowhere, the neurological equivalent of a promise broken before breakfast. By the time Eleanor arrived at 8:47, He was already sitting in the living room with a coldness in his expression that could have frosted glass. She walked in carrying a small paper bag alongside her usual kit. "Morning. I didn't ask you to bring anything. I know it's a croissant from that place on—" "I don't want a croissant. I don't want you to bring me things. I don't want you to come in here every morning with your little bag and your little notebook and act like you know what I need, because you don't." His voice didn't rise. It lowered, which was worse. Controlled. Precise. Each word placed like a weight on a scale. "You are a nurse. You are here because someone is paying you to be here. That's the only reason you walk through that door. And the moment the checks stop clearing, you'll disappear like everyone else. So let's not pretend this is something it isn't." The apartment went quiet. The hum of the city 42 floors below filled the gap like a distant pulse. Eleanor stood near the island, the paper bag still in her hand, and for a moment Daniel thought he'd finally done it. Finally found the combination of words cruel enough to make her leave. She set the bag on the counter, slowly, deliberately. Then she pulled out a chair at the dining table, sat down, and folded her hands in front of her. "Are you done?" she asked. He blinked. "Because if you are, I'd like to check your blood pressure. And if you're not, that's fine too, I can wait." She crossed one ankle over the other beneath the table, her posture relaxed but unmovable, like a tree that had decided where its roots were going and wasn't interested in discussing it further. She wore mauve scrubs today, her dark hair pulled back in a low bun, small gold studs in her ears catching the muted kitchen light. Daniel stared at her. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. "Why won't you just go?" The question came out differently than he intended. Not aggressive, not commanding, but genuinely bewildered, like a man confronted with a math problem that refused to resolve. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Because you need someone who doesn't." The sentence landed somewhere he wasn't prepared for. He felt it hit, not in his chest but deeper, somewhere beneath the armor, in the soft tissue he'd been protecting for months. He looked away, jaw tightening, and said nothing. She waited another moment, then stood and retrieved her kit. She approached his wheelchair without rushing, crouched beside him the way she always did, and wrapped the cuff around his arm. This time, when her fingers brushed his wrist, he didn't flinch. He didn't relax either. But the absence of resistance was something, and they both knew it. 140/92, she murmured, noting it down. Still high, but better than Monday. Thrilling. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, like a light turning on in a room he couldn't quite see into. "I'll take thrilling." She finished the assessment, repacked her bag, and paused at the counter. She slid the paper bag toward him just slightly, the way someone nudges a door open without pushing through. "The croissant is almond," she said, "in case you change your mind." She left at her usual time. The door closed. The apartment breathed. Daniel sat motionless for a long while, his eyes drifting between the window and the small paper bag on the counter. His instinct was to throw it away, to erase the gesture the way he'd been erasing every attempt at connection for months, reducing kindness to transaction, warmth to obligation. But he didn't throw it away. At some point, he couldn't say when exactly. Maybe 10 minutes later, maybe 30. He wheeled to the counter, opened the bag, and pulled out the croissant. It was still warm. Flakes of pastry fell onto the marble as he tore off a piece, and the scent of butter and toasted almond filled his hands, his mouth, the space around him with something so absurdly simple and human that his throat tightened without warning. He ate it slowly by the window, watching the city and not thinking about anything specific, which, for the first time in months, felt like relief. The next morning, when Eleanor arrived at 8:47, the door was already open, not wide, just an inch, a sliver of light from the hallway cutting across the marble floor. She paused, noticing it. Then she walked in. Neither of them mentioned it. But something between them had shifted. Not dramatically, not with fireworks or revelations, but the way tectonic plates shift, silently, deep underground, rearranging the geography of everything above without making a sound. And for the first time since she'd taken his case, Eleanor allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, if the wall had a door after all. She just needed to keep knocking. 3 weeks in, and Daniel had stopped counting the days until Eleanor quit. He hadn't admitted this to himself, not in words, not in any conscious acknowledgement, but the evidence was there in the small adjustments he'd made without thinking. The curtains in the living room were open when she arrived now. The prescription bottles were lined up on the counter instead of shoved into a drawer. He'd started shaving again, not every day, but often enough that his jaw looked deliberate rather than neglected. He told himself these were coincidences, routines reasserting themselves, nothing to do with her. It was a Wednesday afternoon when it happened. Eleanor had left an hour earlier. She'd extended her visits gradually, from the original 30-minute check to something closer to 90 minutes that neither of them formally acknowledged, and Daniel found himself restless in a way that felt unfamiliar. Not the dark, suffocating restlessness of those first months, but something lighter, almost itchy, like a limb waking up after being still too long. He wheeled himself into the study. He hadn't been in this room in weeks, maybe longer. The space smelled of old leather and paper. His father's mahogany desk dominated the center, a relic Daniel had kept more out of guilt than sentiment, and floor-to-ceiling shelves held books he used to read and binders he used to care about. His laptop sat open on the desk, screen dark, and beside it a stack of files his attorney had dropped off months ago that he'd never touched. Foundation paperwork, quarterly reports, grant approvals, beneficiary records from the past 5 years. The Whitfield Foundation had continued operating under the interim director Daniel had reluctantly appointed from his hospital bed, but he'd stopped reading the updates sometime around month 2, when the idea that the world kept functioning without him felt less like a comfort and more like a verdict. He pulled the stack toward him. Dust scattered in the lamplight. He opened the first binder with the mechanical detachment of a man flipping through someone else's mail, scanning columns of numbers, names, grant amounts. The foundation had funded medical treatments, housing assistance, educational scholarships, the usual categories he'd designed years ago, back when building something meaningful felt like the most natural thing in the world. He was about to close the binder when a name stopped him, not in the recent files. In the older records, a grant approval from 7 years ago, flagged under the Emergency Medical Assistance Program. The beneficiary family name was typed in standard 12-point font, unremarkable, buried in a spreadsheet of dozens of similar entries. Voss, Margaret Voss, Emergency Housing Assistance and Medical Treatment Funding, approved. Daniel read it twice, then a third time slower, his finger tracing the line across the page, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. Voss. He pulled up the detailed file. The grant had covered 3 months of mortgage payments for a family facing foreclosure after the primary earner, Margaret Voss, a schoolteacher, had been diagnosed with an autoimmune condition that required specialized treatment not covered by her insurance. The application had been submitted by the daughter, age 22 at the time, nursing student, Eleanor. The realization didn't arrive like a thunderbolt. It arrived like a tide, slow, inevitable, filling spaces he didn't know were empty. He sat in the study with the file open on his lap, the lamplight casting a warm circle around him, and felt something he hadn't felt in so long that it took him a moment to identify it. It wasn't quite gratitude. It wasn't quite wonder. It was the strange, disorienting sensation of discovering that a thread you never knew existed had been connecting you to someone long before you ever met them. Eleanor arrived the next morning at her usual time. The door was open, the full inch that had become their unspoken protocol, and she walked in to find Daniel not at the window, but at the dining table, the foundation binder open in front of him. His expression was different. She noticed it immediately, something behind his eyes that hadn't been there before, a quietness that wasn't withdrawal but attention, as though he was seeing her for the first time. "Sit down," he said. No edge in his voice, no command, almost a request. Eleanor set her bag on the counter, her brow furrowing slightly. "Everything okay? Your color looks—" "I'm fine. Just sit," Please." The please made her pause. She'd heard him say that word maybe twice in 3 weeks, and both times it had been accidental, retracted almost before it landed. This time he let it stand. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat, folding her hands on the table, watching him with the calm, steady gaze that had become her signature in his presence, the one that said, "I'm here. Take your time." Daniel turned the binder around so it faced her. He pointed to the entry. "Margaret Voss," he said. "Emergency medical assistant 7 years ago." Eleanor looked down. Her expression didn't change immediately. It shifted in stages, like clouds moving across a landscape. First recognition, then stillness. Then something deeper, something that made her press her lips together and blink twice, her fingers curling slightly against the tabletop. "That's my mother," she said quietly. "I know." Silence. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of traffic 42 floors below. Eleanor stared at the page, her eyes tracing the typed words, her mother's name, the grant amount, the dates, as though reading a letter she'd written long ago and forgotten about. "We were going to lose the house," she said, her voice low, controlled, but with a tremor running underneath it like a current beneath still water. Mom had just been diagnosed. The treatments they weren't optional, but they weren't covered either. I was working nights at a nursing home and still couldn't, the numbers just didn't. She stopped, took a breath. "Someone at the hospital told me about your foundation. I filled out the application at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, sitting on the kitchen floor because the dining table was covered in medical bills." Daniel listened without interrupting. He watched her face, the way her composure held at the surface while something enormous moved beneath it, the way her thumb pressed hard against her index finger, a self-soothing gesture he'd never noticed before. "I never knew who was behind it," she continued. "The letters came from the foundation, not from a person. I wrote a thank you note, mailed it to the office address. I don't even know if anyone read it." "I read them," Daniel said. "Every one. Every letter from every family. I read them all." His voice was rough, as though the words had to travel through something thick to reach the surface. I never connected the names to faces. There were so many." Eleanor looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, not crying but close, the way the sky looks just before rain begins. "You saved our house, Daniel. You saved my mother's life. And you didn't even know." The weight of that sentence filled the room. Daniel felt it settle on his shoulders, but differently than the weight he was used to carrying. Not the crushing kind, not the kind that pressed him into his chair and made the world feel airless. This was the weight of something mattering, of discovering that a version of himself he'd written off as dead had actually left fingerprints on someone else's survival. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I didn't do it for—" "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why it mattered." Their eyes held across the table, and in that pause, no more than 4 or 5 seconds, though it felt like a doorway opening onto something vast, Daniel understood that this woman sitting across from him was not just a nurse who refused to leave. She was living proof that the man he used to be had done something worth remembering, and maybe, just maybe, that man wasn't as gone as he'd believed. Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand over his, not clinically, not professionally, just her palm resting on the back of his hand, warm and steady, her thumb brushing once across his knuckle, a touch so small and so deliberate that it said more than any sentence either of them could have built. Daniel didn't pull away, and when she finally stood to begin the morning assessment, something in the apartment felt different, not just between them, but in the air itself, as though the penthouse had quietly decided to let the light in. The first session back at Langford Rehabilitation Centre was Eleanor's idea, but Daniel was the one who made the call. He did it on a Friday evening, after she'd left for the day, sitting alone in the study with the foundation binder still open on the desk, like a book he wasn't ready to close. He picked up his phone, scrolled to Marcus Reed's number, still saved, never deleted, despite months of ignored appointments, and pressed call before the familiar voice in his head could talk him out of it. Marcus answered on the second ring. "Well," he said, and Daniel could hear the grin through the phone. "Look who remembered my number. Don't make it a thing." "It's absolutely a thing. Monday at 9. Daniel hesitated. His thumb hovered near the screen, and for a moment the old gravity pulled, the voice that whispered, "What's the point? Nothing changes. You'll fail, and it'll hurt worse than not trying." But underneath it, quieter and steadier, was something else. Eleanor's hand on his. The warmth of her thumb across his knuckle, the way she'd looked at him across the table and said, that's why it mattered. As though the man he used to be was still somewhere inside the man he'd become. "Monday at 9, he said, and hung up before he could take it back. Eleanor arrived Monday morning not in her usual scrubs, but in fitted black leggings and a soft cranberry pullover, her hair in a high ponytail that made her look younger, more open, like a different version of herself emerging from beneath the professional exterior. She carried her usual bag, but also a second one, smaller, a drawstring backpack she slung over one shoulder. "What's that?" Daniel asked, eyeing it from his wheelchair near the kitchen island. "Resistance bands, foam roller, a timer that makes an incredibly annoying sound every 30 seconds. She smiled, a real one, not the careful professional version she'd worn for the first 2 weeks. "I figured if you're doing this, I might as well be useful. You're not my therapist. No, I'm your cheerleader." She said it deadpan, without a trace of irony, and something about the flatness of her delivery made Daniel's mouth twitch involuntarily, a movement so foreign to his face that it almost startled him. Raymond drove them to Langford in the usual black SUV. Eleanor sat beside Daniel in the back seat, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched when the car turned corners. She smelled like vanilla and something faintly herbal, rosemary maybe, or thyme. And Daniel found himself cataloguing the scent without meaning to, the way his brain used to catalogue market data, automatically, obsessively, filing it somewhere he'd access later without admitting why. Marcus was waiting at the entrance, arms crossed, sleeves rolled up as always. He looked at Daniel, then at Eleanor, then back at Daniel, with an expression that managed to say interesting without uttering a word. "Eleanor Voss," she said, extending her hand. "I'm his nurse," Daniel said quickly. "Support system," Eleanor corrected, shaking Marcus's hand. "Also nurse, but today, support system." Marcus led them inside. The rehab center looked the same. Warm lighting, motivational quotes, the faint lo-fi playlist, but Daniel experienced it differently this time. Not as a prison he was being dragged back to, but as a place he had chosen to return to. The distinction was small, but it changed the shape of everything. They started with stretches. Marcus guided Daniel's legs through the familiar range of motion exercises, and Daniel gritted his teeth through the discomfort, muscles that had atrophied from months of neglect, protesting their reawakening like tenants disturbed from a long sleep. Eleanor sat on a bench nearby, not hovering, not coaching, just present. When Daniel glanced at her during a particularly difficult hold, she met his eyes and gave him a single nod. Nothing performative. Just "I see you. Keep going." He kept going. "Okay," Marcus said after 20 minutes, standing and gesturing toward the parallel bars. "I want to try something. Don't panic." "I don't panic. You threw a water bottle at my head last time I suggested standing exercises." That was a controlled throw. Marcus positioned the wheelchair at the end of the bars and locked the brakes. He stood on one side, a support belt in his hands. Eleanor moved without being asked to the other side of the bars, her hands resting lightly on the metal, ready. "The goal isn't walking," Marcus said, his voice calm and precise. "The goal is weight-bearing, even partial. Your legs take whatever they can handle, your arms take the rest. We go slow." Daniel looked at the bars, 2 parallel lines of brushed steel stretching about 8 feet ahead of him, the distance between them just wider than his shoulders. 8 feet. A year ago, he could have crossed them in 3 strides without thinking. Now they looked like a canyon. He gripped the bars. The metal was cool against his palms, and the solidity of it, the unyielding, reliable hardness, anchored something inside him. He pulled himself upright, arms shaking, core engaged, Marcus's belt secure around his waist. His feet touched the mat. He could feel pressure, not fully, not the way he used to, but a muffled awareness of contact, like hearing music through a wall. "That's it," Marcus murmured. "Stay there. Just feel it." Daniel stood. His arms bore most of his weight, his legs trembling beneath him like newborn things unsure of their purpose. The world looked different from standing height, taller, wider, more possible. He could see the top of Eleanor's head across the bar, the wisp of dark hair that had escaped her ponytail curling against the back of her neck. She looked up at him. Their eyes met over the parallel bars, and her expression, her expression, was not pity, not clinical satisfaction, not even pride exactly. It was something more private than that. Something that lived in the space between relief and tenderness. A look that said, "There you are," as though she'd been searching for this version of him and had just found it standing upright between two metal bars in a rehab center on a Monday morning. Daniel's arms trembled. His vision blurred, not from pain but from something rising behind his eyes that he hadn't allowed in months. He blinked hard, jaw clenching, refusing to let it fall. "How long?" he managed. 42 seconds, Marcus said, checking his timer. "New record." 42, Daniel repeated. The number of his floor. The number of the apartment where he'd spent months believing his life was finished. 42 seconds of standing in a body that had tried to give up on him. It wasn't walking, it wasn't running, but it was vertical. It was defiance. Eleanor's hand found the bar beside his, her fingers resting an inch from his knuckles, close enough to feel the heat, close enough to reach. She didn't touch him. She let the almost touch speak for itself, the electricity of proximity doing what contact couldn't. "Sit when you're ready," Marcus said gently. Daniel lowered himself back into the chair, arms burning, breath ragged. He stared at his own hands, shaking, reddened from gripping the bars, and felt something crack open inside his chest. Not break. Crack open. The way earth cracks when something underneath it is trying to grow. Eleanor handed him a water bottle. Their fingers overlapped on the plastic, her warm, his cold, and she held on for half a second longer than necessary. He noticed. She knew he noticed. Neither of them said a word about it. On the drive home, the city looked different through the tinted windows, not indifferent, not mocking, just there, moving, breathing, waiting. A man carried a child on his shoulders on the sidewalk, the same image Daniel had seen weeks ago, from this same car. But this time, instead of looking away, he watched, and something behind his ribs shifted quietly, making room for a feeling he wasn't ready to name, but could no longer pretend wasn't there. That night, alone in the penthouse, Daniel opened the drawer of the console table by the front door, the one where he'd dropped Claire's ring months ago. The ring was still there, glinting faintly. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he closed the drawer gently and wheeled away. Not with bitterness. Not with grief. With something that felt for the first time like letting go. It started with a question Eleanor asked on a Tuesday, not during a medical check or a therapy session, but over coffee. Real coffee. The kind Daniel had started making himself in the mornings, using the espresso machine that had sat untouched on his countertop for the better part of a year. He'd watched a tutorial on his phone the night before, fumbling with the portafilter and the tamper, like a man relearning a language he once spoke fluently, and by the time Eleanor arrived at 8:47, 2 cups sat on the kitchen island, one black, one with oat milk, because he'd noticed how she took hers without ever asking. She picked up the cup, looked at it, then looked at him. He was already drinking his, eyes fixed on the window, pretending it was nothing. "You made me coffee," she said. The machine was already on. "You made me coffee," she repeated, slower this time, the ghost of a smile pulling at the edge of her mouth. She took a sip. "It's good. Don't sound so surprised." They drank in silence for a while, a comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled, the kind that 2 people earn only after weeks of navigating the harder, heavier kind. Eleanor leaned against the counter, one ankle crossed over the other. Her raspberry-colored cardigan pushed up to her elbows, and Daniel sat in his wheelchair on the opposite side of the island, the morning light catching the steam that rose from their cups in thin, curling threads. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said, setting her cup down. "You usually don't wait for permission." "Fair," She paused, choosing her words the way someone handles something fragile. The foundation. What made you start it? Daniel's fingers tightened around his cup, not defensively, reflexively, the way a hand closes around something precious when it senses a wind picking up. He hadn't talked about the foundation in months, not its operations, not its mission, not the version of himself that had built it from the ground up, with nothing but a conviction that money sitting still was money wasted. "My father," he said after a moment. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual armor. He grew up poor, not the kind of poor people romanticize, the kind where you skip meals and lie about it. By the time he built his company, he was terrified of ever going back, so he hoarded everything, invested everything, protected everything. Daniel turned his cup slowly on the marble, and when he died, he left behind more money than anyone could spend in 3 lifetimes, and not a single person who genuinely missed him. Eleanor said nothing. She listened the way she always did, fully without performing attentiveness, her body still, her eyes steady on his face. "I didn't want that," Daniel continued. "I looked at what he'd accumulated and I thought, what if instead of protecting all of this, I gave it a purpose? What if the money actually did something?" He exhaled. "So I started the foundation. Small at first, a few grants, a few scholarships. Then it grew. Medical assistance, housing, education. It became—" He trailed off, searching for the word. "It became you," Eleanor finished. He looked at her. The accuracy of it, the way she'd reached into the center of something he couldn't articulate and named it, made his chest tighten. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "It became me. And then the accident happened and I stopped being me and it just kept going without me. Like I was never necessary to begin with." Eleanor set her cup down and leaned forward slightly, closing the distance across the island by a few deliberate inches. "That's not what it means, Daniel. It kept going because you built something strong enough to survive without you. That's not irrelevance, that's legacy." The word landed in the quiet kitchen like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples he could feel but not see. Legacy. He'd used that word in speeches, in board presentations, in fundraising galas, where he stood at podiums in tailored suits and spoke about impact and generational change. But hearing it now, in his own kitchen, in sweatpants, from a woman in Raspberry who had once been one of the names in his spreadsheets, it meant something entirely different. It meant the thing you leave behind still breathes after you stop believing you matter. "I haven't looked at the new applications in months," he admitted. "There's a backlog. The interim director's been handling it, but she doesn't—" He stopped, reconsidered. "She does a good job, but she doesn't know why I started it. She manages it like a business. I built it like a promise." Daniel stared at her. The morning light fell across her face in a warm diagonal, illuminating the faint freckles across her nose that he'd never noticed before, and something inside him tilted. Not fell, not collapsed, but tilted, the way a compass needle swings when it finally finds north. "You should go back to it," Eleanor said, not pushing, offering. "Not because you have to, because I think you need to remember who you were before you decided to forget." That afternoon, for the first time since the accident, Daniel opened his laptop and logged into the Foundation's internal portal. The interface was familiar, the same dashboard he'd designed himself, clean lines, the Whitfield logo in muted gold at the top, but navigating it felt archaeological, like brushing dust off something he'd buried. There were 247 pending applications, 247 families, individuals, students, patients, each one a name attached to a story, attached to a need. He began reading. Slowly at first, one file at a time, the way a man re-enters cold water inch by inch. A single mother in the Bronx whose son needed surgery, a teenager in Newark applying for a coding scholarship, an elderly couple in Queens facing eviction after a medical bankruptcy. Each file was a mirror, not of his pain but of his purpose, the thing that had existed before the accident, before the wheelchair, before the silence, the thing Eleanor had called a promise. He read for 3 hours straight. When Eleanor arrived the next morning, she found him still at the desk, laptop open, a legal pad covered in handwritten notes beside him, names circled, numbers underlined, question marks in the margins where he needed more information. "Have you slept?" she asked, setting her bag down. "Some." He didn't look up. His pen moved across the pad, and there was something in his posture she hadn't seen before. Not the rigid defensiveness he wore like a uniform, but a forward lean, an engagement, the physical language of a man reaching toward something instead of bracing against it. She walked to the desk and looked over his shoulder. The legal pad was covered in his handwriting, sharp, angular, surprisingly elegant. She read a few lines. Morrison family, medical, urgent. Expand eligibility for housing grants. Call Rodriguez Re-Scholarship Fund allocation. Daniel. He looked up. Their faces were close, closer than the parallel bars, closer than the blood pressure checks, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes and the faint line of a scar near his left temple that she'd never been near enough to notice. "Welcome back," she whispered. Something passed between them in that moment. Not a touch, not a kiss, but a recognition. The acknowledgement that the man sitting at this desk, surrounded by the evidence of lives he could still change, was not the same man who had told her to leave on that first Thursday morning. He was not healed. He was not whole. But he was reaching, and reaching was everything. Daniel held her gaze. His hand, still holding the pen, rested on the desk, inches from where her fingers lay on the edge of the legal pad. The distance between their hands hummed with a warmth that neither of them closed and neither of them moved away from. "I want to restructure the medical assistance program," he said, his voice carrying a steadiness that sounded new. "Expand it. Make it faster. I keep reading these files and thinking, if we'd been slower 7 years ago, if the process had taken 2 more weeks. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They both knew what lived at the end of it. Eleanor's family. Eleanor's mother. The house they almost lost. She placed her hand on his shoulder, not briefly, not as a pat. She let it rest there, her palm warm through the fabric of his charcoal Henley, her thumb settling against the curve of muscle where his neck met his shoulder. He felt the pressure of it travel through him like a current, not electric but thermal, the slow spread of warmth into places that had been cold so long he'd forgotten they could feel anything else. "Then let's get to work," she said. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the penthouse didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a starting line. It happened on a night neither of them had planned for. Daniel had spent the afternoon at Langford, his 3rd session that week, a pace that would have been unthinkable a month ago. Marcus had pushed him harder than usual, standing exercises, weight transfers, and for the first time, 2 assisted steps between the parallel bars. Not walking, not quite, but movement, deliberate, shaking, defiant movement, his legs carrying a fraction of his weight while his arms gripped the bars and his jaw locked tight with a concentration that left him drenched in sweat. Eleanor had been there, as she always was now, standing at the far end of the bars like a lighthouse at the edge of a difficult shore. When he completed the 2nd step, she didn't clap, didn't cheer. She just exhaled, a long unsteady breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and something about that involuntary release meant more to him than any applause ever could. By the time they got back to the penthouse, the sun had already started its descent behind the Manhattan skyline, painting the living room in shades of amber and rose gold. Daniel was exhausted in a way that felt earned rather than emptying. His muscles ached, his arms were heavy, but there was a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with exertion. "You should eat something," Eleanor said, setting her bag by the door. She hadn't officially extended her hours, but the boundaries of her visits had blurred so gradually that neither of them could identify when the professional container had quietly dissolved. She came at 8:47 and left when the conversation ran out, which lately meant well past dark. "I ordered Thai," Daniel said, wheeling toward the kitchen. "Should be here in 20. You ordered for both of us? You don't like Pad CEW? I love Pad CU. That's not the point." "Then what's the point?" Eleanor leaned against the counter and looked at him. Really looked, the way she'd been doing more frequently in the past few days, with an attention that went past the medical and into something uncharted. "The point is, That 3 weeks ago you wouldn't even let me bring you a croissant. Now you're ordering me dinner." Daniel's fingers drummed once on his armrest, that restless tap she'd come to recognize as his tell, the signal that something was happening beneath the surface he wasn't ready to name. "People change," he said. "People don't just change, Daniel. Something changes them." The words hung in the warm, fading light of the kitchen, and Daniel felt them settle around him like a net, not trapping, but catching, holding. He looked at Eleanor standing against his counter in her wine-colored cardigan, her hair loosened from its usual bun and falling past her shoulders in dark waves she rarely let him see, and he understood with sudden, disarming clarity that the something she was talking about was her. The food arrived. They ate at the dining table, the same table where he'd shown her the foundation binder, where everything between them had shifted without either of them drawing attention to the tilt. The pad see ew was too spicy, and the spring rolls were slightly cold, and neither of them cared. Eleanor told him about nursing school, about the anatomy professor who made his students name every bone in the body while standing on one foot, about the night she'd fallen asleep in the hospital break room and woken up with a stethoscope imprint on her cheek. Daniel laughed, actually laughed, a sound that started somewhere deep and unfamiliar, and surprised them both so thoroughly that Eleanor stopped mid-sentence and stared at him. "What?" he said, the laugh still fading at the edges of his mouth. "Nothing. I just—" She shook her head, a smile spreading across her face that she didn't try to control. "I haven't heard you laugh before. Not like that." "Like what?" "Like you meant it." The smile stayed on her face, and Daniel watched it the way someone watches a candle flame in a dark room, drawn to it, warmed by it, aware of how easily it could go out. He wanted to say something honest, something that matched the size of what he was feeling, but the words were tangled up in months of silence and self-protection, and all he managed was, "Stay." Eleanor tilted her head. "I'm still eating." "No, I mean—" He set his fork down. His hand rested on the table, palm up, fingers slightly open. An offering, a question. "Stay, after dinner. Just stay." She looked at his hand, at his face, at the vulnerability laid bare in the space between the two. A man who had spent months pushing everyone away, now asking someone to remain, and meaning it in a way that transcended schedules and medical charts and professional boundaries that had long since ceased to describe what they were to each other. She placed her hand in his. Her fingers closed around his palm, warm, deliberate, certain. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll stay." After dinner, they moved to the living room. Daniel transferred himself to the leather sofa, a maneuver that still required effort but had become smoother with weeks of rebuilt strength, and Eleanor sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The city glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the penthouse was quiet, except for the low hum of the espresso machine he'd forgotten to turn off, and the distant, muffled heartbeat of Manhattan 42 floors below. "I need to tell you something," Daniel said. He was staring straight ahead at the skyline, his jaw working the way it did when he was building a sentence he wasn't sure he could finish. "And I need you to not say anything clinical." "I'll try." He turned to her. The lamplight caught the angles of his face, the sharp jaw, the scar near his temple, the eyes that had been guarded for so long and were now slowly, carefully, letting her see what was behind them. 6 months ago, I was convinced my life was over. Not just the walking, everything, the person I'd been, the things I cared about, the ability to feel anything that wasn't anger or emptiness. He paused. His throat moved. "And then you showed up, and you didn't leave." Eleanor's breath caught, a small involuntary hitch that she couldn't hide and didn't try to. Her hand was still in his, and she felt his thumb trace a slow line across her knuckles, the same gesture she'd made across his hand that day at the dining table, returned now like an echo finding its way home. "You came back every morning," he continued, his voice low, rough-edged, stripped of every defense he'd ever built. "Through the door, I left open an inch, past every wall I put up. You stayed through the worst of me, and I don't—" His voice cracked, just slightly, a fracture in a voice that had spent months being made of stone. "I don't know how to deserve that, But I know I don't want you to stop." Eleanor turned toward him. Her free hand rose to his face, slowly, giving him time to pull away, to flinch, to retreat behind the armor he'd worn so long it had started to feel like skin. He didn't move. Her fingers touched his jaw, tracing the line of stubble, settling against his cheek with a tenderness that made the air between them feel sacred and dangerous all at once. "You don't have to deserve it," she whispered. "You just have to let it in." He leaned into her hand. A small movement. The kind of surrender that costs more than any grand gesture. The quiet admission that he was tired of holding himself apart from the world, tired of testing people's limits, tired of bracing for the sound of a closing door. Her palm was warm against his skin, and he could smell vanilla and rosemary and something underneath that was just her, just Eleanor, the scent he'd been cataloguing without permission for weeks. He kissed her, not urgently, not desperately, slowly, the way a man crosses a threshold he knows he can't uncross, fully aware and choosing it anyway. His hand came up to the back of her neck, fingers threading into her hair, and he felt her exhale against his lips, felt the tension she'd been carrying dissolve into the space between them as she kissed him back. Her hand slid from his jaw to his chest, resting over his heart, and he wondered if she could feel how fast it was beating. This heart that had been so still for so long now, hammering against his ribs like something trying to break free. When they pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, breathing, sharing air. The city outside continued its relentless motion, but inside the penthouse, time had paused to let them catch up. "I'm terrified," Daniel said quietly, his eyes still closed. "Of what?" "That this is the part where it goes wrong, where I ruin it, where you realize—" "Daniel." Her voice was firm, tender, both at once. "Open your eyes." He did. She was right there, inches away, her dark eyes holding his with a fierceness that left no room for doubt, no space for the old narratives of abandonment and loss to slide back in. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Not because someone's paying me. Not because I feel sorry for you. Because somewhere between the croissant you didn't want and the coffee you pretended wasn't for me, I fell in love with the most stubborn, broken, extraordinary man I've ever known." Daniel's hand tightened around hers. He pulled her closer, gently, carefully, wrapping his arms around her and holding her against his chest the way a man holds something he's afraid to let go of, and more afraid never to hold. She tucked her head beneath his chin, her hands still resting over his heart, and they stayed that way, tangled together on the leather sofa, the city glowing behind them, for a long time. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. The silence between them had changed again, no longer the weapon it had been in those early days, no longer the test, but something else entirely. Something warm, something shared, something that sounded, if you listened closely enough, like a beginning. The morning after the kiss, Daniel woke before his alarm. That alone was unusual. For months, mornings had been something he endured rather than entered willingly, dragging himself from sleep like a man pulling himself out of deep water. But today his eyes opened at 6:12 a.m. and stayed open, his mind already alert, already reaching toward the day with an energy that felt borrowed from a version of himself he'd almost forgotten existed. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling. The eucalyptus diffuser hummed softly on the nightstand, and the first pale threads of sunlight crept through the curtains, drawing thin gold lines across the sheets. His lips still carried the ghost of her, not a taste exactly, but a warmth, a pressure, the memory of contact that his body had stored somewhere deeper than muscle or nerve. He touched his mouth without thinking, then dropped his hand, feeling foolish and not caring. The penthouse was quiet, but it was a different quiet now. Not the suffocating silence of absence, but the held-breath stillness of anticipation, the kind of quiet that exists just before something begins. He transferred into his wheelchair, made coffee, 2 cups oat milk in hers, and wheeled to the window. The city was waking up below him, yellow cabs threading through early traffic, joggers moving along the river path in the distance. A woman on the sidewalk adjusted a child's backpack, crouching to zip the pocket, and the child said something that made her laugh. Daniel watched them and felt no bitterness. just observation, just presence. Just a man looking at the world without needing it to be anything other than what it was. His phone buzzed. A text from Eleanor. No words, just a photograph of 2 coffees on her own kitchen counter side by side with a single question mark. He smiled. Actually smiled alone with no one to perform it for. The expression felt strange on his face, like wearing a coat he hadn't put on in a long time and discovering it still fit. "Already made yours," he typed back. "It's getting cold." She arrived 12 minutes early, 8:35 instead of 8:47. She didn't mention the change, and neither did he, but the 12 minutes said something. A small admission of eagerness neither of them was ready to speak aloud, but both understood perfectly. She wore a soft ivory blouse tucked into dark trousers, her hair down around her shoulders, small gold hoops in her ears. No scrubs. The absence of the uniform was its own statement, not a rejection of her role, but an acknowledgement that whatever she was walking into this morning had outgrown the container of nurse and patient. "Hi," she said, standing in the doorway. "Hi," he said from the kitchen island. They looked at each other across the length of the apartment, and the space between them vibrated with everything that had happened on that sofa, and everything that hadn't been said since. Daniel felt the pull, to address it, to define it, to build a framework around whatever this was so it couldn't shift beneath him without warning. But Eleanor stepped inside, picked up her coffee, took a sip, and said, "This is better than yesterday's." I adjusted the grind, noted. And just like that, they were in it. Together. Without ceremony, without a defining conversation, without the need to construct something official out of what was already unmistakably real. The days that followed held a texture Daniel hadn't experienced before, not the frantic busyness of his pre-accident life, not the hollow stagnation of the months after, but something in between, something with rhythm. He continued therapy at Langford 3 times a week. Marcus had him progressing to longer-standing intervals, tentative weight shifts, the agonizing beginnings of supported steps that left his legs trembling and his shirt soaked through. Eleanor was there for every session, and her presence had shifted from observer to participant. She'd learned the exercises, anticipated his frustration before it crested, and had developed a silent language with Marcus made of glances and small nods that communicated things Daniel pretended not to notice. But it was outside the rehab center that the real reconstruction was happening. Daniel had thrown himself back into the foundation with an intensity that surprised even him. He spent mornings on calls with the interim director, a capable woman named Priya Sharma, who had kept the machine running during his absence and who, to her credit, showed no resentment when he began reclaiming his role. He restructured the medical assistance pipeline, cutting processing time nearly in half. He personally reviewed the backlogged applications, flagging urgent cases, writing notes in the margins in his sharp, angular handwriting. And he began something new, a mentorship initiative designed to pair foundation beneficiaries with professionals in their field, a bridge between financial support and long-term self-sufficiency. "It's not enough to write a check," he told Eleanor one evening, the two of them sitting on the living room floor, her on a cushion, him transferred out of his wheelchair and leaning against the sofa, their shoulders touching. Legal pads and printed files surrounded them like fallen leaves. "Money solves the immediate problem. But what happens after the money runs out? People need connection. They need someone who sees them." Eleanor looked at him. The lamplight caught the gold of her earrings and the warmth in her eyes, and she reached over and straightened a page that had slipped from the stack near his knee. "Someone like you saw me," she said quietly, 7 years ago, before you even knew my name." His hand found hers among the papers, their fingers interlaced, a gesture that had become instinctive, as natural as breathing, the physical punctuation of a bond that no longer needed explanation. "I want to do more of that," he said. "I want to be the person who sees." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Her hair smelled of vanilla, and he felt the weight of her, not a burden, but a grounding, a gravity that held him to the present moment and made it feel worth inhabiting. "You already are," she murmured. There were difficult days, too. Days when his body refused to cooperate, when the nerves below T10 went silent and his legs felt like strangers again. Days when the old darkness crept in at the edges, not the total eclipse it had once been, but a shadow, a reminder that healing wasn't linear and that the man he was becoming still carried the scars of the man he'd been. On those days, Eleanor didn't try to fix him. She didn't offer motivational speeches or silver linings. She sat beside him in the quiet and let the difficulty be difficult, and somehow that was enough. One evening, after a particularly hard session at Langford, where Daniel's right leg had given out completely during a standing exercise, and he'd collapsed against Marcus with a fury that left him silent for the entire drive home, Eleanor found him in the study, staring at the framed photographs he'd turned face down months ago. She stood in the doorway, watching. He hadn't turned them upright, not yet, but his hand rested on the back of one frame, his thumb tracing the edge of it, the way someone touches a door they're considering opening. "You don't have to look at them tonight," she said softly. "I know." His voice was low, thick with something he was still learning how to carry without breaking under. "But I think I want to. Soon." She crossed the room and stood beside him, not touching, just close. Close enough that he could feel her warmth, the quiet pulse of her presence, the unspoken promise that when he did turn those frames over, when he finally looked at photographs of himself, standing, running, living in a body that no longer existed, she would be right there beside him. "Soon," she agreed, and in the silence that followed, between the study's leather-scented air and the city's distant hum, Daniel felt something he'd believed the accident had permanently destroyed, the belief that his story wasn't over, that the chapters ahead could hold things he hadn't imagined, that the man in the wheelchair and the man in the photographs were not two different people, but one continuous life, still being written, with her. There is a moment in every life when the weight of what has happened threatens to become the definition of what will be. Daniel Whitfield knew that moment intimately, had lived inside it for months, letting the wreckage of a single night on a wet highway become the only story he told himself about who he was. But stories, as Eleanor had shown him, are not written by what happens to us. They are written by what we choose to do after. The morning Daniel turned those photographs upright, every single one, frame by frame, his hands steady and his eyes burning but open, Eleanor stood beside him in the study and said nothing. She didn't need to. The act itself was the language, a man choosing to look at his past without letting it imprison his future. The photographs showed a version of him that was gone, standing, running, unbroken in the ways the world measures wholeness. But the man looking at them was someone that earlier version had never been, someone who understood that strength was not the absence of damage, but the decision to keep building despite it. What Daniel could not have known on the night of the accident was that the worst moment of his life was also planting the seed of its most meaningful chapter. He could not have known that a foundation built from generosity would one day send back to him the very person capable of reaching through his walls. He could not have known that a grant approval signed years ago, one name among hundreds, would become the hand that pulled him back from the edge of a life unlived. And perhaps that is the truest thing this story has to offer, that kindness does not expire. It does not vanish when we forget about it. It moves through the world quietly, passing from hand to hand, and sometimes in ways we could never predict. It finds its way back to us precisely when we need it most. Daniel would never run again. Some mornings his legs still refused him, and the wheelchair remained a part of his daily landscape. But beside him sat a woman who had taught him that love is not a reward for being whole. It is the thing that makes wholeness possible. And ahead of him stretched a life he had almost thrown away, now reclaimed, now reimagined, now filled with the kind of purpose that only someone who has touched the bottom can truly understand. Let me introduce you to our new app, Allure TV. It's super simple to get started. You log in with Google or your email. In a few seconds you're in. This here is the home screen. Look how amazing it is. We feature dozens of intense, uncensored romance stories, organized by genre. We have mafia, billionaire, forbidden love, and contract romance themes. We have absolutely everything you could ever want. And the best part, no ads and no interruptions. Now look at this. Click here on the audio and start listening right away. You can even choose your preferred language. There's Portuguese, English, German, French. If you prefer to read, just click here on the ebook and that's it. The whole story appears for you to read at your own pace. And you can even interact. You are welcome to rate the story with stars and leave a comment. You can also add your favorite stories to a playlist and access them whenever you like. Do you like what you see? Go ahead and log in now. It is simple and free. You can find the link in the first pinned comment.